How do we design products that people like? To do that, we're going to look into why we like things, why it changes over time, and the strategies designers can use to design beautiful products. Our aim is to design a product that is useful, effective, beautiful, and inherently likable. Now we know that function of products is affected by multiple factors. The practical, what it does, the aesthetic, how it looks and what it feels like, the symbolic, what it means, and signs, the cues that we use to understand the product. In this, we're going to focus on aesthetic function, the impact on the senses, its appearance, style, texture, balance, ambience, sound, and so on. We should not underestimate the importance of industrial design in this way. The importance of industrial design to culture. Del Coates, in his book Watches Tells More Than Time, states the importance of this. Mass-produced products do not merely overwhelm the fine arts and other less prolific sources of meaning artifacts. Collectively, they constitute nothing less than a mass medium of such enormous scope and influence that it rivals TV and the movies in its ability to influence mindsets and behavior. Industrial designers have a great deal of responsibility. The things that we design affect our culture. So how do we make things likable? How do we successfully design things that appeal to people and make the visual environment more pleasant? Tom Heath said, "The designer's problem thus is not to produce something which everyone will inevitably like. It is rather to produce something which the majority of people can learn to like, something which has likable qualities." Likable things have likable qualities. But what are these likable qualities? How do we find things likable? Well, firstly, we must understand that we search for patterns, for meaning, for order. The human brain is addicted to pattern recognition. We like finding and identifying patterns even when they're not there. So our ability to detect patterns allows us to identify things such as faces or symmetry very rapidly. We can see the leopard camouflaged against this background quite quickly. We can even see the owl, even though the background is very complicated. We can recognize that eye and identify the creature in its setting. And of course, it also means that sometimes we see things that aren't there. We recognize faces quite often in symmetrical objects, even when they're not faces. So patterns help us make sense of things. Patterns are recognized by our brain, which gives us some sense of understanding and, I believe, a certain amount of pleasure. I think the pattern recognition process is pleasing to us. Recognition is pleasurable, and it also helps us make sense of the world. After all, you only learn something relative to something you already understand. This is where it's helpful to understand how the human brain is programmed, our wetware, our operating system, how we respond to external stimulus and make sense of it. The first is order, which we could think of as things that make sense. They are easy to understand, almost familiar. In this sense, order has a low degree of information. It's less stimulating, it's familiar, it's understandable. The opposite of this is new information. Variety is different. It's more stimulating because it's novel. It has new information, sometimes a lot, so it's very stimulating. It has a high degree of stuff for us that's new. Words we associate with order are harmony, simplicity, and unity. The most highly harmonious, unified form is the sphere. The only single element in this form is radius. There's nothing else. Of course, too much order can be boring. There's not much to stimulate us, and that can be unpleasant as well. Variety is our thirst for new things. It drives us to seek out new experiences. The words we associate with variety are novelty, surprise, and complexity. As the saying goes, variety is the spice of life. The right amount of variety is interesting. Too much variety, too much novelty makes it difficult to make sense of what we're experiencing. If we can't make sense of it, it becomes unappealing. It makes no sense. It is nonsense, literally no sense. So this beautiful alarm clock concept is quite hard to understand at first. So it's perhaps too confusing to be appealing. If the stimuli is too overloading, we can experience an almost physical sense of repulsion for things that appear very different from what we're used to. Of course, this is dependent on our frame of reference, our experiences and interests. People who are into body modification might find this image interesting, or in some cases, even perhaps boring. Therefore, we are constantly in search of a balance between order and variety, the familiar and the novel. One of the founding fathers of industrial design, Raymond Loewy, understood this. He realized that too much novelty, too much innovation was unpleasant. He said, "The adult's public taste is not necessarily ready to accept the logical solutions to their requirements if the solution implies too vast a departure from what they have been conditioned into accepting as the norm." He developed a guiding principle for his industrial design practice, MAIA, most advanced yet acceptable, and explains that people reject innovation if it's too unfamiliar. Loewy attempted to introduce new approaches by including familiar elements that people could relate to, striking a balance between order and variety, between innovation and understandability. So understandable innovation is a way to make new products more palatable to the marketplace. This is an example of a set-top box trying to depart from the conventional boring box by literally putting a different slant on it. The Boxee box wasn't successful in the marketplace. It was only on sale for a couple of years, although I'm not sure what combination of price, features and appearance led to its failure. It's still a good example of maintaining familiar elements, such as the ports in the back, while adding a novel appearance in order to distinguish itself from its competitors, so stand out just a little bit on the living room counter below the television. Why don't we all like the same things? Our experiences change us. The novel becomes familiar over time. So we have the same operating system, the same wetware, but different experiences. And so we have different reference points, different levels of understanding and different preferences. So some things are popular because cultures steer people to become familiar with the same things. In a given culture, we generally all learn a lot about certain things because we're exposed to them frequently. But some things are only popular with a niche group, a smaller group of people. And this is because in our culture we have a wide degree of choice in the things that we choose to learn more about. These things, which are popular with only a few people, are appreciated because of arcane knowledge. Arcane meaning understood by few. Let's look at an example. Some people become very interested in cars. This interest drives the acquisition of deep knowledge that most people don't acquire. This deep understanding creates appreciation that the wider population might not have. This is the Chrysler PT Cruiser, a car that's very different from most vehicles on the road. Some people find it unpleasant, most likely because it's so different. It breaks the rules of what a car should look like. However, if we know a lot about cars, and certainly if we know something about the history of cars, we might see it differently. Car enthusiasts understand the historical references for the PT Cruiser. The wheel arches, the running boards, the grille, these things reference cars of the 1930s and the 1940s. Understanding these references makes it possible to learn to appreciate and make sense of this novel stimulus. How do our preferences change? Well, they change through our understanding. As we understand something, like the PT Cruiser, we can start to appreciate it because it starts to make sense for us. And the loss of novelty through familiarity means that the novel becomes the familiar, and so that can change our preferences. Del Coates proposes a framework for understanding how we like things and why that changes over time. Buckle up. This can become quite involved. Coates talks about 4 ingredients of successful design: contrast, novelty, subjective consinity, and objective consinity, and the attractiveness of these things being valency. So information is the processing load. Contrast and novelty gives us stuff to take in. Subjective and objective consinity gives us meaning and pattern that we can understand. And valence is the attraction or repulsion that these 4 factors create when we see a product or experience a product. Let's talk about information first, contrast and novelty. Information imposes a processing load on our nervous system. Complex objects impose a greater load than simple objects. They are inherently more stimulating. Contrast is the measurable differences that stay constant. In this data projector, we can see contrasting lines and surfaces and also colors and textures that are quite similar and thus low in contrast. So if we look at the form, the lines in the form, we can see repetition of these radii. They both use a radius, but also contrasting in more generously curved forms. So the contrast of the physical form and its colors and its textures, we can measure these things. They don't change over time. No matter how long we look at the object, those contrast elements are still there. The amount of visual information or complexity in these products in terms of geometry and color is different. So the one on the left has few elements and the one on the right has many elements. It has a more complex topography, more elements, more different shapes, if you like. And in the case of these calculators, the more ordered form has the more repetition. It has fewer elements used repeatedly. The one on the right has a greater variety of different shapes and textures and colors. So it's a little bit more stimulating, more contrasting. Novel stimulus is new, things that are unfamiliar to us. This is the perceived difference between what we're looking at and what we think of as normal, the stereotypical version of the thing. The stereotype is the expected form. This is not directly measurable because it's constantly changing. Something novel becomes less novel as we are more exposed to it. The Helena milk jug has jug-like qualities, even without the conventional handle. This milk jug has multiple departures from the stereotype and is thus harder to understand. As we study the design, we can learn to make sense of it and may come to appreciate its virtues. In this case, a form which combines milk dispensing with sugar storage. And so, hey, that makes kind of sense, even though it looks very different from a jug. When we put these two elements together, how these two factors interact, the measurable contrast within an object and how much it departs from its stereotype, is what Coates refers to as the arousal scale, which is a measure of how stimulating a thing is to us. For example, an object with a moderate amount of contrast, but treated in a way that's unconventional, has quite a lot of novelty. This has more, if you like, visual weight. Its high novelty is very stimulating. It provides high levels of sensory arousal for us, at least if we haven't seen it before. So this is high on the arousal scale. A similar object that contains even greater levels of contrast and novelty would be even more stimulating. It registers higher on the arousal scale. Over time, however, as we become familiar with it, let's say if we own it, the object loses its novelty and only the inherent contrast remains. It becomes less stimulating. This means that familiar things are less stimulating, which partly explains why our feelings about things change. The arousal potential of an object is always declining with exposure. Let's return to Coates' other ingredients. Subjective and objective consinity. Consinity is an old word that Coates has revived. The dictionary definition is skillfully put together, beautiful, internal harmony or fitness, mutual adaptation of parts. What that means is things kind of look like they belong together. Elegance. So all these words together create a sense of beauty. Consinity is in form is easier to perceive, easier to understand, easier to remember. The sense within it makes it feel beautiful, something that has a logic to it. This can take a couple of forms. Objective consinity are the measurable similarities among visual attributes, such as the shape. In this product we can see lots of circular elements. Also the color, we can see silver is used to tie the different parts of the product together. And texture, we have a very smooth texture on those silver elements. And so this repetition, these similarities of the visual attributes are recognizable. The objective concinnity is easy to take in. Concinnity can take in other forms. Continuity. So aligning elements creates a continuity of form. This order creates a recognizable pattern that is perhaps subconsciously appreciated. Let's look at something as complicated as a vehicle. Continuity of shape is one way of increasing the similarity between elements and the overall concinnity of the form. In this example, I'm going to look at the Range Rover Evoque, which was closely based on the Land Rover LRX concept vehicle. So this is the concept vehicle, and this is the production vehicle. It's quite unusual for a concept vehicle and a production vehicle to be so very close. So we can see there are circular elements centering around the wheels and echoed in the wheel arches. And we can also see lines that flow through the shape. These lines are strongly aligned, so they continue through the form. So even when they're broken by the wheel arches, these lines continue from one side to the other. So these lines are strongly aligned. Relatively few shapes and lines make up the whole vehicle, and these elements tend to be aligned. So this creates a highly ordered vehicle with high objective concinnity. Subjective concinnity is the similarity between the product, what we have in front of us, the stereotype of the product, what we kind of expect from products of this kind, and its ideal, what we perhaps hope for. And this might be something we haven't clearly imagined, but we just want it to be better, perhaps in some way. This subjective concinnity is related to our expectations. This changes over time as we are exposed to more things. We get used to the novelty. This reference point for stereotype and ideal depends on our exposure to things in a given category. This is why designers who become experts on the things they design tend to have more developed tastes than laypeople. They simply have a much bigger reference file to draw on, which affects their sense of stereotype and ideals. We could summarize this as visual and symbolic sense, a type of understanding. We can look at these things and derive meaning and understanding from the elements. Let's come back to those 4 ingredients of successful design: contrast, novelty, subjective concinnity, and objective concinnity. And now we can put them together in a kind of visual mechanism that helps us understand attraction and repulsion. This is Coates' theory of why we're attracted to things and why that changes over time. For example, in the diagram that we're looking at now, we could say this object, the object that this is being measured by, has a good amount of contrast and quite a lot of novelty, and this makes it stimulating. It also has a good amount of subjective concinnity and objective concinnity, which means it kind of makes sense to us. And when we put these two things together, we could say, I like it. It makes sense. It's new. It's interesting. Yes, we are attracted to it. Now let's take an object which has low subjective and objective concinnity but lots of novelty. It might be something we've never seen before. We don't really understand it. So the information could be overloading. It's too much for us to take in, and it's not balanced by a sense of reason, an understanding of what it is. So it's like, huh? And we put those two things together and we get a response which is often, oh, that's ugly. I don't like it. So this is negative valence. Now, over time, that novelty evaporates, it goes away through exposure, and the balance tilts towards indifference. It's become boring. It doesn't have much subjective and objective concinnity, so it doesn't help us make sense of it or understand it. And the novelty goes, so it's kind of like you're indifferent to it. So what does this mean? How do we design in likability? Well, there are a few simple strategies. Firstly, we try and increase subjective concinnity. We reduce the number of elements in the form. We increase the repetition of, say, shapes and colors. We try and align elements, and we use continuity of form. Look at this example. This is a water cooler. Now, this is a little bit novel. It has a tilting geometry, which maybe even seems like it's going to fall over. And so it's a bit weird. But this subjective concinnity, we can see familiar elements such as the tap. It looks like a lot of taps in products like this. And then we start to notice the places that we're supposed to touch it, the tap and the attachment of the tap to the vessel. So we could obviously remove it. We can see the lid that we'd open to put liquid in and the handle that we'd use to carry the device. And so the designers have coloured the contact elements blue. And as we study that, we think, that kind of starts to make sense. And the objective concinnity is a simple colour scheme, a very simple geometry. It uses those ribs, those repeating lines, just a very similar element repeated through the main body of the unit. And so taken together, we have something that's a little bit novel, but it's understandable. Here's another example, the Dyson Supersonic hairdryer. Now this product is quite novel. It has a very high-tech appearance. It uses a sophisticated and novel motor, and it echoes this in the form with the high-tech metallic surfaces, and it's an unusual shape for a hairdryer in proportion. But it's familiar. It has subjective concinnity in the form of a handle and a barrel, which is kind of familiar for a hairdryer, and the objective concinnity, which is a simple colour scheme and a simplified geometry. Now this is important for a $500 hairdryer. It needs to be relatable. Remember Lowry's most advanced yet acceptable. The second thing we can do is increase objective concinnity. We need to have recognizable symbolic logic matched to the user group. So we need elements that the user can recognize. And this might mean that we need to incorporate elements of the object's stereotype into the design to give them a visual way of getting a grasp of the product, of understanding it. So familiar elements become important. Here's an unusual design, a drop of rainwater, a rain barrel that attaches to the downpipe, the drain pipes of the house. And it's got quite an unusual shape for something attached to a house, a very bulbous organic shape. So it's kind of weird. But let's have a look. When we start to study it, we can see the handle on the watering can is familiar. And it uses a green form, which is quite familiar in gardening equipment. And then we start to notice the tap down the bottom is also green. And so again, we see the contact areas have been colored the same way. And it has a very simplified palette. And so when we start to study it, we start to understand the reason for the way it is. And that reason, that understanding, builds our sense of subjective concinnity. The objective concinnity of a simplified palette, simplified forms that unify the design, and so on. And so, although it's a bit weird, it's got some novelty, we understand why it is the way it is, and so we can start to appreciate it. Coates uses the phrase "concinnous innovation." Whilst parting from when we part from the norm, we can still make sense of something that's innovative by using recognizable elements. Now, this could take the form of a skeuomorph. Now, what's a skeuomorph? Well, if we look at the dictionary definition, a skeuomorph is an object or feature which imitates the design of a similar artifact made from another material. So the classical example of this is the Greek column. So the fluting in the Greek column, something we're familiar with from this style of architecture, echoes the styles of columns of wooden Greek temples. So when the Greeks started making temples, they originally made them out of other elements. They made them out of wood. And one approach was to bind timbers together in parallel to make large columns of multiple sticks or multiple tree trunks. And these vertical lines were kept when the Greeks moved to using stone because they seemed right to them. And so the fluting in the columns is a skeuomorph, a reference to a different material. We can see this in software as well as hardware. So in the iPhone of 2007, we can see the camera icon is a reference to a different type of material, if you like. So the software element uses a recognizable camera lens. Now, the more recent version of the operating system uses a stylized form. People understand smartphone cameras now, and they don't need to see them so realistically rendered to understand that that's the camera function. So this is always changing as our familiarity with the technology changes. We can see this more recently as Apple is ushering in a different way of interacting with the smartphone. So since its inception, the iPhone has had a home button, a physical button. It is kind of like your get out of jail card, your escape button. No matter where you are in the iPhone, pressing the home button will take you home. It's very familiar and easy to understand. Now, the latest iPhone, the iPhone X, introduces a gesture. It eliminates the button, further simplifies the design, and people have had to learn how to do a gesture. And Apple have waited to do this to the point where people are ready for it. They're familiar with touchscreens and gestures on touchscreens for how to do things. So this continuous innovation is about not going too fast for your user group. The third thing we can do is control novelty wisely. Now, we shouldn't be afraid of novelty. Novelty is beneficial, but too much is destructive. So we want to eliminate random novelty and use meaningful novelty that is relevant to the user group. Let's look at this smoke detector. Now, this is a very unusual form for a smoke detector. Most smoke detectors are sort of disc-like things which are anonymous and easy to ignore. This one takes the form of a bird. It has quite high contrast colors, the black and the white in this case. It's a very novel form. We don't normally see bird-like smoke detectors. The limited colors help avoid a too decorative color palette, which makes the product more controlled and therefore more credible. So the objective vicinity of the fewer visual elements makes it seem like it's well designed. And the visual metaphor, the canary in the coal mine warning us of invisible danger, once we realize that subjective vicinity, that meaning kicks in, and it makes sense to us. So we start to appreciate it. What at first seemed like a childish, silly form starts to become whimsical and interesting and done in a very restrained way. So it starts to be appreciated. Here's a more familiar object, a motorcycle helmet. It's recognizably a motorcycle helmet. It has many of the elements of motorcycle helmet, the head-shaped head covering, and the buckles and the visor, and yet it introduces some interesting topography to the shape of the helmet. It has a little bit of an angle to it, and then the air vent has been emphasized to increase the novelty. So a little bit of novelty adds that little bit of that spice. And remember that a high degree of order can be novel because most products are reasonably complex, and by simplifying the elements away in a fairly austere way, that can be a very novel treatment that makes the simple object look quite interesting. So aesthetic function is important to products, and it's something that industrial designers are responsible for. Let's recap on what we've learned. How we like things is related to novelty. Humans enjoy novelty, but not too much of it. We like to recognize familiar elements and make sense of things. And we understand new things in relation to things we already know. So our reference file of what things should look like helps us understand new things when we can recognize certain elements. We can design in likability, firstly by understanding our user group and what they are used to. We can increase subjective vicinity, the aesthetic logic of the form, and we can increase objective vicinity, the symbolic logic, the meaning of something. And we need to control novelty to add interest, but not too much. So go out there, delight your users, make beautiful things, and make the world a better place.